Why change with that? Why mess with that tradition? Well, there's two things I think. One is that our audience isn't the same. It's not a static audience. Our students are different. That doesn't mean to say they're permanently different. It just means to say that you can't assume that something that's worked for the last 100 years or the 100 years before that will be as effective in our current society. So the learner isn't static. Our teaching methods probably can't be static. I also don't advocate a lot of experimentation for the sake of it, because we don't want to sacrifice a year or two of students because we're superficially playing games with our learning techniques. We can't go that road either. But we can't assume that what was effective as a way to achieve learning outcomes 500 years ago will automatically translate now. And in fact, what I've noticed is that I was achieving less and less when I looked at my students, and yet I was more experienced. I was achieving less than when I first came in the early 90s, yet I was more experienced. The world isn't static. The kinds of skills my students need when they leave here aren't exactly the same kind of skills they needed when they left here in the 90s. Many of them are fundamental and basic, and they do need them, but they weren't demonstrating even those to the same level of competence, I felt, as they were doing in the 90s. So the treadmill was moving, but the educational system wasn't on that same treadmill. And I felt like we were falling behind because probably we were fixated on a certain content emphasis. And the world is more and more full of content. So if what we see of as education is having students walk away with more and more of the fact-based knowledge that comes from content, we were never going to keep up, because we have a 3-year curriculum for undergraduates, and yet there's probably 10 times more what we want to tell them in our fields than there were 20 or 50 years ago. So we can't keep up that way. It has to be about them gaining the skills to discover for themselves. Lecture now, just like 500 years ago, was probably a terrible way to transfer those skills. However, 500 years ago, it was enough to know different facts. You probably were differentially competitive as a learned person 500 years ago because of your familiarity with different facts that came from being in a rarefied environment with other people who knew those facts than it is true now, because the facts are easy to come by. The facts are no longer an elite kind of currency. But being able to discover those facts or being able to manipulate and put them into different context, that remains to be the difference between a learned and a non-learned person. So lecture has probably always been a terrible way to transfer the skill of how to learn. But it wasn't as important 500 years ago as it is now, and hence lecture is just exposing itself as probably a very poor way to run a tertiary institution if your goal is to have students who become independent and competent.